One thing that we commented during the interval with ROPA was this, I and Simon, we found that the amount of money you said the government, federal government invests in higher education is very low compared to the size of the system. I mean, you mentioned something between $4 and $5 billion. Well, but already at that time there was lots of students, so it's much more than Brazil now. And comparing to the Brazilian, I think the federal government invests now. It depends how you look, because there are many ways of looking at the money that gets to the universities. But I think it's well over 10. It's about 10 billion between 10 billion and $15 billion. The whole federal system in Brazil, I think. And there are more the states, which is almost the same size, and then all the private. So I find that in funding, we haven't talked much about funding. So I'd like a view of when you look at the systems, as we are looking here, regulation, funding. How do you see? I'd like to hear about China. If you have some of how the government, because we are seeing this huge amount of money being put into higher education. Is there any? We know in Brazil, I know a little bit, but of course you can say something about how government is trying to. Is there any relationship between how much money is invested in performance? So you have all this regulation. Is the regulation for the private sector is basically accreditation and some aspects like that, regulating the authorization to function and to grant degrees, basically. But in the public sector, are there performance indicators that are used for allocating money? I think in China, it seems that there are some institutes that have been chosen by the government, and the government puts more money, maybe in Beijing or Tsinghua, and some others that they say, these are the ones that we want to move up in the league tables. I know that in Brazil, the federal government has talked about that inside the government, the ministry, of choosing some of the federal universities and maybe think about doing that. But this goes against the equality tradition of the federal government, especially in the Workers' Party government years. Is there in China any talk of in India, any talk of performance-related financing? So I'd like you to mention that in this context of expansion and investment.
Yes, thank you for three fascinating presentations around policy, and it's a pity that we didn't get the South African case next to it, but that's a case that I know relatively well, and the three cases are in their detail and in their reflection, also from a comparative perspective, very important. And the big question for me is how to make sense of it from a policy analysis perspective. Given that the concepts and analytical tools used in policy analysis come from the West. And in hearing your presentations and trying to analyze them, it's clear that, let's say, traditional Western concepts and analytical tools for making sense of policy do not necessarily fit the specific kinds of dynamics in your cases. Let's, for example, take the notion of policy failure or the notion of policy implementation. In essence, all three cases were, when it comes to expansion, and expansion is a goal in all three, three countries. All three countries were examples of failures. Also China, where the goal was 15%, and it's 26%. Yeah. Now, let's say a traditional Western case, that would be seen at least as a problem, maybe not a failure, but a problem, given the cost attached to it. And the prime example there is Britain, which also opened up access to higher education in the early 1990s with a goal of moving towards around 20% of participation, and the end result was approaching 40% in a short time range. So it also relates to the question of what are the change drivers in the systems. Given that policy as such is not enough as an explanatory concept for change and for explaining change. I think one of the underlying elements in here is the balance between student demand and provision to absorb the student demand. And I think China is the example where the student demand increased much more rapidly than the government had foreseen, but where there was a balance in the provision of higher education to absorb the demand at a much higher level than was planned. While the other two countries haven't been able to find a way in their system to balance student demand, to increase student demand at the level expected, and to provide the kind of programs that are needed to absorb the student demand. And then the question, of course, is why was the balance between student demand and provision in China effective, even more effective than foreseen, and not in the other two systems? And I think that is one area we could look at in the analysis. Another one is to, again, link to notions of policy failure and policy success, is to come back to a very important point that was mentioned in the first presentation, and that is the notion of crisis. What is a notion of crisis and how is it interpreted as a crisis? Because if you look at the Chinese case and the way you describe it, there was the strong emphasis of the state on the needs of society and the need of higher education to, as you described it, produce outputs that can meet the state's needs. Now, an interesting question is how far away is the way in which the state expresses the needs of society from this general global template of a research university, which, for example, in '68 in Brazil was the underlying model for the reform. Now, how far away is the state's interpretation of the needs of society from this global research university, which is supposed to be innovative and contribute to creating jobs and economic growth, etc. Because if the crisis is that the state's needs are in another direction than what generally can be expected of this template of a research university, then the question is when is the Chinese case, when can it be interpreted as a crisis? When the universities do not develop in the framework of this general template, or when they do not produce the kind of outputs that the state has indicated that they need. And these are not necessarily the same. So again, thank you for three very interesting presentations, and I look forward to reading the chapters and also to see the analysis, as indicated, to try to understand the dynamics that lead to the outcomes that are so different between the three countries.
Thank you for the presentation, but I have a very pointed question to Professor Elena. Well, Professor, from the point of view of development, economic development and growth, the key group is these 70% students, because they will work in the farms, are they that will work in the plants and in the offices. And in spite of the effort of the Brazilian government, the quality point is not, the system of evaluation is not working. They are still a very key group. But a kind of solution we should find for this problem. In your opinion, and it's clear that this system is not working and will be a very conflictuous one. In your opinion, what kind of solution, what kind of trend we can discuss and try in order to solve this kind of problem?
I think that maybe we should answer the questions, and then there is another round of questions for the public. Okay?
Well, thank you for those questions. Very challenging and very inspiring questions. I guess for me, there are two questions I need to address. First is the whether or not there is a performance-based funding mechanism. Forgive my limited knowledge because this is not really my area. To my knowledge, I don't think there's a system-wide performance-based funding mechanism in China. Largely, it happens by categories, as I elaborated. For those chosen elite universities aiming at a world-class standing, obviously they're getting more and extra resources from the government. But for the SAM categories, to my knowledge, I don't think there's a performance-based funding mechanism. Perhaps Professor Yan can correct me, because this is really your area. If you have anything to say, you're welcome. Second is about Professor Manson's notion, the policy failure. I would not rather to use this concept, policy failure. I would rather use policy variations, because I don't believe the government, the Chinese government set the goal as 15%. I mean, conceptually, it raised the goal as having the mass higher education system, but it doesn't necessarily supposed to stop at 15%. But of course, sometimes expanding happened even faster than the government expected. So I would rather call that the policy variations. And I think at that point in my presentation, there's emerging the divergent interests. The local governments, the universities themselves wish to expand or enlarge, even faster than the government expected for their own interest, because they somehow the big, in their views, means strong, means more powerful. So this is basically for their own interest. Just one last point. I think you mentioned whether or not we should use Western-rooted conceptual framework or the theories to explain, in the non-Western societies. I don't necessarily think that's an issue for me. Some theories, many experiments travel across cultures. Whether or not they can have the analysis depends on their power, their analytical power. So that should be tested. I think somehow it's a good thing if you use the Western-rooted theory to explain non-Western societies. If it works, which means they have the transcultural border explaining power.
I'll just address the question first on funding, and I would depend on my colleagues to help clarify that as well. From my understanding, there's a very big difference between the central and the state government funding. The central government institutions only account for less than 20% of the entire population in terms of institutions and what's accommodated. The large part of the population is in the state government, funded by the state governments. The central government puts in a lot more funding to these fewer institutions, so they're much better funded than the state government funded institutions, which are the ones that lag a lot of funding sources. As far as I know, and my colleagues can correct me, there isn't a mechanism that looks at funding based on performance, but the central institutions have a very specific mandate in their performance regulations in terms of meeting national agendas just as Chang would have suggested in their system, and therefore the funding is much larger than you would see within the state system. Am I correct in stating that? But as such, there is no funding mechanism based on performance, as far as I know, until this date. In terms of policy, in terms of the drivers in the system, it's kind of an interesting analogy in terms of thinking about how China has managed to maintain a much higher growth, perhaps, than what was expected. I think in India it's been a fascinating case where the government, at least the latest reports indicate that they think it's been a policy success because they've been able to reach close to 15% of GR participation. And going back to this notion of crisis, from what I can gauge from the Indian system, the crisis is GR, increasing the enrollment within the system, bringing the enrollment up. That's what's seen as the crux of the issue in terms of higher education. So as long as the focus is on increasing the participation rates, the government feels it's meeting its policy directives. And as far as the reports go, it indicates that it's done a good job in terms of increasing the number of institutions. Of course, it's not enough, but we've seen that the system has actually been absorbed by the privatization of higher education over the last many years. It's not something recent. So I think in the Indian context, it's privatization that's helped manage the increased GR enrollments within the system as well. But that is not seen necessarily as a crisis within the system. The crisis is overall increasing GR to come anywhere close to 24% of GR, which would sort of bring it more to the level of most developing countries and developed countries.
Well, thank you for the question on the 70% of Brazilian students that attend to private education. With regard to Peter, I don't know if I understood well, but my reaction would be like, every country needs some knowledge institutions, like research universities inside, and some global players. So if you have world-class universities, that would be important for the country. But how much this meets the needs of society, that's a point to specify, to detail. And this, I think society needs as much as those 70% youngsters that are being educated in the private sector. And that's really off control of the country's regulation mechanisms. So moving to the other question, my reaction would be like, first thing we need is to accept private education as a legitimate and a probably good choice for the country. That it was made already in 1968. So we got to accept it and work with the private, understand what are the pros and cons, and try to make the best out of it. So we need cooperation. We need to open up to understand what sector is this, what do we like, what we don't like, and another, we have to do the same with international providers that are already here. And another dimension of my answer is what kind of evaluation makes a difference. And from what I learned, what I know, my opinion today is that evaluation works when it's interactive, when it builds cooperation and trust among the actors, and also the exchange of first-hand information. So when you have these peer committees visiting institutions and visiting courses and talking with each other's problems and figuring out what to do, this is what really improves quality, and not this forms filling, inspection behavior that we have in Brazil. So that's it.
Okay, there are other people needing to ask. I will ask.
Thank you. In all three countries, economic growth stagnated after very long periods of very steady and in some cases quite dramatic growth. And my question is, what degree of coordination is there between higher education planning and economic planning? because each of these three countries, I don't know Brazil very well, but in India, India has to really move in stimulating its manufacturing sectors and its service sectors, whereas China has to change economic policy and make it more inward, domestic demand-driven. So the question really is about what degree is there some coordination of planning between the higher education and the economic sectors?
Okay, thank you for the presentations. My question is a bit related to Peter's question and Cassier's comment as well. The picture that comes is of an over-regulated environment. Brazil, an example, but also all these commissions, tons of recommendations coming out from India, and I guess similar things in China. This reminds me of the classic work of people like Niels Brunson and others of reform as routine. So reform becomes so routinized. So then the question is, if reform is routine, how do higher education institutions, the players, respond to this? Because one thing are the policy signals become ambiguous and often contradictory and so on. And, you know, are they responding to the internal expectations of stakeholder groups? Do they respond to the changing needs of the marketplace, whatever they are? Or do they respond to other institutions? Because there's increasing evidence that in a number of sectors, when the environment is increasingly volatile and changing, organizations, and I assume universities included, will respond to the responses of others. In other ways, an environment characterized by, you know, players responding to what other players are responding because they can't make sense of what's happening. And I wonder whether you could give us a sense of you see signs of that in your systems.
I agree with Professor Zha's arguments that China, we don't have performance-based volume for funding. Basically, the funding mechanism goes through 3 stages. So in the first stage, that's incremental funding formula based on the historical data. Each institution gets how much money each institution can get in past years. And the second stage is the quarter based on enrollment and plus special project. That's based on, mostly based on the enrollment, how much students each university recruit. And the third stage, that's take discipline into account, because each discipline, the cost for each discipline varies. So the most current formula takes discipline into account. For example, physics is more expensive than sociology. So the most current mechanism takes complexity cost into account. And China higher education enrollment increased dramatically. And one reason, I think, is labor market played a role, because economists studied economic rate of return for higher education. In past years, that's increased dramatically. And before China opened door and reform policy is only around 3%. And after China adopted market mechanism and the economic return increased to the international standard, is around 10%. So my question is about India and Brazil. What's the economic rate of return for your higher education if you have this data?
Look, I'm not very comfortable because I'm not sure that we are talking about policy or we are talking about regulation and over-regulation, as Romuald said, in the sense that when you look at China, it's a good example of policy, and it's in the sense that you have a challenge. You have to tackle this challenge, and you choose some goals in order to do that. You choose resources, and you adopt a series of actions. I don't see it in the case of India, in the case of Brazil, in the case of South Africa, in the sense that in the case of South Africa, for instance, over-regulation, all the time changing regulations and norms, etc. In the case of Brazil, 1,000 laws, decrees, and norms. What's the logic? Look for the logic of that. I think that there is one not very clear, not very expressed objective, goal, or challenge since the late 60s, when there was this problem created by the fact that a very large number of students didn't have access to university. They passed the exams, there was no place for them. So there was a judicial problem. And then the military government decided that the entrance wasn't anymore for habilitation, but was only for selection. The problem disappeared. And the government proceeded to respond to this challenge. The number of the access was restricted. The number of prepared students was much larger than that. And to promote the private, but what's the policy goal from that time since to Lula's government in terms of responding to this challenge? Because the challenge was left to the households. All the expansion of the higher education in Brazil was totally funded by the households, not by the government. And the higher education public sector was funded, and it continues to be funded by tax money. But that's the policy that I can see. But well, that's it.
Okay. Is there any other question? Peter has another. This is the last question because we need to finish the
Yeah, I think it's as a kind of follow-up to the responses. It's of importance because this session is about policy to look at the processes that we're interested in when we talk about policy. And if you put it simply, you can say that in a policy context, it's determined what kind of regulatory and financial frameworks and mechanisms state authorities are producing that are supposed to have certain effects in the higher education system. And what is of interest is what is leading to certain kind of effects or success, and what is leading to either no change or a change in a direction other than foreseen, and when is that regarded as a failure. Now, the Chinese context, I understand that the rapid increase, which is the fastest increase in student numbers any system in any time of human history has experienced, I understand that that is not a crisis. But what you referred to, they used the word failure, was the fact that Chinese universities fail to engender innovative minds. Now, both in China as well as in India and Brazil, the question is when certain functioning, certain performances, certain aspects of the dynamics of higher education aren't functioning in a way that's expected and that is seen as such a problem that it becomes part of a public debate. And it can be expansion, like in Brazil, it can be the functioning of the for-profit private sector, like in Brazil, it can be the lack of expansion in India, or it can be the lack of the production of innovative minds in the Chinese universities. To what extent is this seen as a failure of policy? Or is it seen as a failure of the university to respond to effective policy incentives? And that relates to another dimension, that is the learning curve in policy. So is there an evaluative learning dimension also in China, which makes it possible to analyze why universities don't produce the innovative kind of minds that would be expected, and what it would mean for the regulatory and financial frames within the within which the universities operate?
start again. A number of questions. First is about the coordination, right? Your question is about coordination between the needs, social demand. Well, I would say China should do a good job in this regard. China just stepped out the planned economy, and planned economy should have featured very close coordination between what is needed and what's supposed to be supplied. But the puzzling thing to me is it's not really the reality. One piece of the evidence I can provide is the unemployment issue of the university graduates. This is a really pressing issue in the Chinese society. I guess Professor Yan and Cai and Yang can provide even detailed figures. My understanding is now it should be like 6 million, around 6 million university graduates are now really employed. And so in that sense, I think it's a positive scenario. It could be a failure in terms of the coordination, but I don't really understand. On the other hand, it brings me to Romano's question. I have to admit, I don't really understand that question, but somehow I figured out it's about how to construct the normative basis among the stakeholders, if I understand it correctly. That's an interesting question. I think that's something the stakeholders in China should address this. Somehow it's caused by too hasty expansion. So there should be kind of the shifts of these normative basis. We all, I guess most people in this room are familiar with Martin Tro's classical concept of stage development in higher education, right? Less than 15% is elite, more than 15% is mass, and more than 50% is a universal education. But behind that, I think what is missing from pictures, there should be a guiding ideologies, or maybe we can call it a normative basis. In the elite higher education stage, I guess the normative basis is how to make good use of the resources in order to efficiently using the resources, in order to make the access to higher education wider and wider. Once you reach the mass higher education stage, I guess the guiding ideology could be the social justice. And once you reach the universal higher education, I think the focus now should be how to develop and fulfill the human potentials. That leads me to the final question by Professor Manson, which is about a policy failure. I guess during the break, we discussed the concept of limit. In a sense, the higher education developed in China, in the current form, has reached limit. In the past 2 decades to 3 decades, the fast economic growth in China was pretty much based on the cheap labors, and now it has to shift to the different modes in a knowledge-based economy, pretty much from the innovation. And that's why the society, the government sector is raised the new demands for the universities. It's hard to discern this is the policy goals or this is the policy environment. Maybe they combine it together. But in that sense, I think in this point, universities failed to fulfill the government demands.
I guess the first question was about the economic development in the country and the parallel with higher education reform. There are 2 things, I think, from what I understand. The Knowledge Commission that was established by the Prime Minister to make India a knowledge economy was very much based on the economic reforms in the country. So moving India to a knowledge economy was considered very much a link with that. But from what I gather, there's a lot of criticism that higher education has been the last bastion of the license Raj. It's very difficult to change compared to most other systems within India. And so there is a feeling like as though the higher education sector has not opened up the way industry has, or the way the other aspects of the higher education, other aspects of Indian society and industry have. Would you agree with that assessment? So there's this feeling that it's still lagging behind the other kinds of developments that have happened within the Indian setup. In terms of reform being routine, I would think reform is still pretty new in India. The changes, even though they're occurring over time, starting with the late 1990s and into 2000, my feeling from what I see is that this change is very new to the system, and it's rapid. So I wouldn't suggest that it's necessarily routine as yet, in many ways. How our systems responding to that is sort of tied to the other questions on policy and regulations, and I don't see policy and regulators as distinctly different, because what I see in the Indian context is regulation is a form of a mechanism to ensure that policy gets implemented and there are policy outcomes that are intended. Regulation is a very core policy issue in India. Governance is a policy issue in India because it regulates quality, it assures quality, it assures autonomy to institutions. So in a sense, I think there are very clear mechanisms in India, there are very clear directions of where the policy is in terms of what the government is expecting to achieve and what it would like to achieve. I think there's a confusion within the system as to how to get there using the regulatory frameworks that are already existing or creating new ones. But the ones that are getting created seem to be falling back right into the system, which is the problem to begin with. So in terms of success or failure, as I said, I think from the government perspective, from what I've read, they would suggest that they have seen or tasted some amount of policy success. I'm not sure they would agree there's policy failure as of now, but there are definitely policy challenges, and the regulation and the governance framework is a major one within the Indian context. I'm glad I have 3 economists from India to answer the question on the economic rate of return, and I'll let them do so. But all I would add is that I think in the Indian context, one of the key issues is that even though we have a high number of graduates, they aren't prepared for the job market. They aren't as qualified as the industry would like them to be. So from what I understand, there's a whole parallel system that has been established by Indian industry to train the graduates that they hire to be making them more job ready for the kinds of graduates they would like to have. So in some sense, they haven't prepared them. The system hasn't prepared them from what I can gather. But I am going to give the floor to my colleagues to add to that as well in terms of the question of the economic return as well as the parallel between higher ed and economics.
It's been around 11 to 12%. And when you try to look in terms of the private rate of returns to higher education, the last study says around 15%, but that's the methodology is controversial. But still, most of the studies say that it's around 13% in India, for the year 2010 and 11.
Thank you.
Lots of questions. So about coordination between higher education and planning, we have a lot of discrepancies in Brazil. So in this specific area, there's main discrepancies between the Minister of Education, the Minister of Science, Technology, and Innovation. So at the Minister of Education, including CAPES, the agency that conducts the evaluation procedures for the graduate school programs, the goal, what is rewarded there, it's international scientific publications, it's scientific productivity, and the graduation of new PhDs and stuff. This doesn't assure any relevance of the research to the country. The Minister of Science, Technology, and Innovation has been fighting for more interaction between the university research system with the private sector, and to develop some strategic fields of research. And Brazil has some, I think Beth mentioned the nanotechnology and biotechnology, some new areas that Brazil works. Also, giving incentives for professors to spend some time in enterprise or start their own business. So there's an innovation law in Brazil that creates a lot of opportunities and space for engagement of university in socio-economic development. But we don't have a good coordination, not that I can talk about right now. Reform routine and to whom the players are responding to. There's no much analysis on this, not that I know. I bumped into research with the IPOs, the open capital institutions, and about who they would define as their main competitors. I have to read it with attention. I didn't have time to do that, but I could include in my chapter. What I know is that when the market responds to market behavior, and in the more scientific research university segment, they answer to their peers in their field of work and to money. So the Reuni got some success, like offering lots of money for the federal university to grow. And with regard to rate of return, I don't know of any in Brazil. The Brazilian higher education lacks some very important information. So I don't know, do we have a rate of return calculation? Huh? Well,
I think, as you can see, I think it's higher than the international average, actually.
Well, a lot of Brazilian economists calculate this, right? And but as far as I know, they are the individual return. It's income elasticity of higher education. And so, in the past, it was very high. Nowadays, is declining, but is still more high. The level is still more high than the international, and of course, than the European height. Pardon? Yes, I don't remember the figures, but some, if you are interested, you can find some Brazilian studies.
So,
I just wanted to add one point in terms of the policy-making process in India. What I find fascinating is I think the government itself is frustrated with not being able to push policy reforms as fast as they would like to see, because there is severe opposition and because the policy-making process that they have to undergo is very, very challenging for them. So they're not able to implement the process as fast and as furiously as they would like to and see the effects that they might see in a place like China.
Back to information about higher education, I didn't know about, I understood return rates as something related to financial investment. We invested some money, what's the rate of return of your investment? And if we're talking about public, free education, I don't know if this term makes sense. So anyway, it's not an information that is public. I'm a specialist in higher education, I can't answer you. So we don't make any follow-up studies of our graduates in a regular basis. There's one or another initiative of one institution or so. That's a very important information to offer to the society. How long does it take to get a job? Are you working in the field of your studies? And we don't have this in Brazil. Moving on. You ask what the government does with this situation that leaving the challenge of expansion in the shoulders of the families, of the households. Well, Lula tried to address the lack of income in many ways and made it cheaper. And my son says it's going to blow up at some point. That makes too low. Yes, and then we chose a system for Brazil that doesn't look very good for our income distribution profile. We chose a private higher education system to a country that struggles a lot with income distribution, so it's kind of tricky. But this government tried to make the higher education the cheapest possible, I mean, giving a lot of scholarships. And the learning curve in Brazil, it's much lower and slower than it should be. We don't learn from each other. Each new government started over, and it's very, they change names of things that remain almost the same, and they keep the same name of things that they change completely. So it's really, they don't help. They don't learn, and they don't help society to follow what's going on.
I just realized I forgot one sentence, and that sentence is too important to let it go. Just now, I stopped at in a sense, universities failed to fulfill the social and government demands in terms of nurturing the innovative minds. The tricky part is the government itself should take a lot of responsibility for this due to its continuous excessive control into the coordination of higher education and also the knowledge production process. Precisely in that sense, I argue dilemma, or even worse, crisis.
Let's finish the session. We are going to start again by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, okay? Because we have a long session in the afternoon. Thank you.